My 5-year-old daughter's tricycle triggered a bullet. Karen Mitchell, our HOA president, had sent 3 warnings about eyesores. That night, she marched into our driveway with a loaded gun. One scream, one shot, and my little girl was bleeding on the concrete. As SWAT teams stormed our peaceful suburb, I cradled Emma's broken body, begging her to stay alive. This is how a child's joy became a target. Emma's giggles echoed down Maplewood Lane until Karen Mitchell's shadow cut across our driveway. "I warned you, Tom," she hissed. Her hand tightened around her purse. That's when I saw the glint of metal. The sun was setting over Maplewood Lane, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was one of those perfect autumn evenings in our small neighborhood, the kind where the air carried the scent of fallen leaves and would smoke from distant chimneys. Children's laughter echoed from various driveways and front yards as parents began calling them in for dinner. This was suburbia at its finest, peaceful, safe, and filled with the simple joys of family life. My 5-year-old daughter, Emma, was riding her bright red tricycle in our driveway, her infectious giggles filling the crisp evening air. Her golden curls bounced with each enthusiastic pedal, catching the last rays of sunlight like spun silk. Her tiny hands gripped the handlebars with fierce determination, her little legs pumping as she navigated imaginary adventures around our modest driveway. She wore her favorite purple dress with rainbow stripes, the one she insisted on wearing every other day despite my wife's protests about variety. I stood on our front porch, cradling a steaming mug of coffee between my palms, watching Emma with a kind of pure contentment that only comes from witnessing your child's unbridled joy. She was my world, my little ray of sunshine who could brighten even the darkest days with her innocent laughter and endless questions about everything from why the sky was blue to whether dinosaurs would like ice cream. The neighborhood around us was the picture of American suburban tranquility. Neat rows of colonial and ranch-style homes lined both sides of the tree-lined street, each with carefully manicured lawns and flower beds that were just beginning to show the first hints of autumn color. Mrs. Henderson was watering her prized rose garden next door, occasionally waving at Emma as she rode by. The Johnsons were grilling something that smelled absolutely delicious, their teenage son practicing basketball shots in their driveway. It was the kind of evening that made you feel grateful for the simple pleasures of life. But then, like a dark cloud suddenly blocking out the sun, I heard it, a sharp, angry voice cutting through the peaceful evening calm like a knife. It was Karen Mitchell, the HOA president, storming across the street with the fury of a woman possessed. Her face was flushed deep red, her graying hair pulled back in a severe bun that seemed to stretch her features into a permanent scowl. Her arms were crossed tightly across her chest, and her sensible shoes clicked aggressively against the pavement with each purposeful step. Karen Mitchell was a woman who lived and breathed rules. In the 3 years since she'd been elected HOA president, she had turned our peaceful neighborhood into something resembling a military compound. No music after 8 p.m. No lawn decorations except during approved holidays. No children's toys left visible from the street. No parking on the grass, even during parties. No fence repairs without written approval. And absolutely no deviation from the approved paint colors for front doors. She'd sent violation notices to Mrs. Peterson for hanging her laundry outside, to the Garcias for planting sunflowers in their front yard, and to virtually every family with children for some minor infraction or another. This month alone, I'd received 3 official letters about Emma's tricycle cluttering the driveway and diminishing the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal. Each letter was more threatening than the last, with increasingly larger fines and mentions of potential legal action. I'd ignored them all. It was a child's tricycle, not a rusted car or construction equipment. Emma was 5 years old, and she deserved to play in her own driveway without fear of bureaucratic harassment. I told you to keep that thing in the garage, Karen shouted, her voice carrying across the street loud enough to make several neighbors pause their evening activities and turn to stare. Her finger pointed accusingly at Emma's tricycle as if it were a weapon of mass destruction rather than a simple child's toy. The volume of her voice was so jarring that Emma immediately stopped pedaling, her small head turning toward the source of the angry noise with confusion written across her cherubic features. Karen, it's just a tricycle. She's playing. It's not hurting anyone, I replied, setting down my coffee mug and stepping off the porch. I kept my voice level and reasonable, though I could feel my jaw tightening with barely controlled frustration. I moved toward Emma instinctively, wanting to position myself between her and this angry woman who seemed to view childhood joy as a personal affront. Not hurting anyone? Karen snapped, her voice rising to what could only be described as a shriek. It's an eyesore. This neighborhood has standards, and you're single-handedly ruining the property values for everyone. I have worked too hard to maintain the prestige of Maplewood Lane to let some negligent parent destroy everything. She was closer now, having crossed the street and entered our driveway without invitation. Her finger jabbed aggressively at the air between us, and I could see the veins in her neck bulging with the intensity of her rage. Emma shrank back on her tricycle, her small hands gripping the handlebars so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her earlier joy had been completely replaced by confusion and the first hints of fear as she watched the strange woman yell at her daddy. Karen, she's 5 years old. Let it go, I said, my voice becoming firmer as I placed a protective hand on Emma's shoulder. I could feel her small body trembling beneath my palm, and it ignited a protective fury in my chest that I struggled to keep in check. There are real problems in the world. This isn't one of them. But Karen wasn't done. Her eyes had taken on a wild, unhinged quality that I'd never seen before, even during her most heated HOA meetings. Her face was now purple with rage, and spittle flew from her lips as she continued her tirade. She reached into her oversized purse with shaking hands, and my blood turned to ice when I caught the unmistakable glint of metal. A gun! Karen, what are you doing? I yelled, immediately stepping fully in front of Emma, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. People didn't pull guns over children's toys. This was suburban America, not some war zone. Put that down right now. You think you can ignore me? Karen screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. You think the rules don't apply to you? I run this neighborhood. I maintain the standards. You don't get to break my rules and make me look weak. Her entire body was shaking now, the gun wavering dangerously in her unsteady grasp. Put the gun down, I shouted, raising both hands in a gesture of surrender while simultaneously trying to shield Emma with my body. My mind raced, trying to process this surreal nightmare. Behind me, I could hear Emma whimpering, her tiny voice calling out, Daddy. Daddy, what's happening? The sound of my daughter's frightened voice in that moment will haunt me for the rest of my life. Before I could react, before I could tackle Karen or grab Emma and run, a deafening bang split the peaceful evening air. The sound was impossibly loud, echoing off the houses and seeming to reverberate through my very bones. Pain exploded through my left shoulder like liquid fire, and I stumbled backward, my vision blurring as shock began to set in. But the pain in my shoulder was nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the sound that came next, a scream. A sound so filled with pain and terror that it seemed to tear something fundamental inside my chest. I spun around, ignoring the burning agony in my shoulder, and my heart completely shattered at what I saw. Emma was on the ground beside her overturned tricycle, clutching her right leg with both hands. Blood was seeping through her favorite purple dress, spreading in a dark stain that grew larger by the second. Her face was chalk white, except for the tears streaming down her cheeks, and her mouth was open in a continuous wail of pain and confusion. Emma. I dropped to my knees beside her, my own injury forgotten in the face of my daughter's suffering. The concrete scraped against my kneecaps, but I barely noticed. My hands hovered over her wound, afraid to touch it and cause more pain, but desperate to help her somehow. It hurts. Daddy, she whispered between sobs, her voice so small and broken that it nearly destroyed me. It hurt so much. Behind us, Karen stood frozen like a statue, the smoking gun still clutched in her hand. Her mouth hung open in what appeared to be shock, as if she couldn't quite believe what she'd just done. The neighborhood around us had erupted into chaos. Doors were slamming open as neighbors ran out of their houses, some screaming, others shouting questions, all of them drawn by the unmistakable sound of gunfire in their peaceful suburban sanctuary. Mrs. Henderson dropped her garden hose and came running, her face pale with horror. The Johnsons abandoned their grill and sprinted across the street. Someone, I think it was Mr. Chin from 3 houses down, was already on his phone with 911, his voice shaking as he tried to explain the impossible situation to the dispatcher. I pressed my hand against Emma's wound, trying to stem the bleeding while fighting back my own tears. The blood was warm and sticky, soaking through my fingers despite my efforts. "Stay with me, baby," I whispered, my voice breaking. "You're going to be okay. Daddy's here. You're so brave, Emma. You're the bravest little girl in the world." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder by the second. Karen finally seems to snap out of her trance, looking down at the gun in her hand as if seeing it for the first time. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice barely audible above the chaos. "I was just trying to." She wouldn't listen. She dropped the gun like it had suddenly burst into flames and backed away from us, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine panic. Without another word, she turned and ran toward her house, her sensible shoes slipping on the damp grass as she fled. I heard her front door slam shut behind her, followed by the sound of multiple deadbolts being engaged. The paramedics arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours as I knelt there holding my wounded daughter. They were professionals, calm and efficient even in the face of such senseless violence. 2 of them immediately went to work on Emma, while a third examined my shoulder wound. "She's stable," one of them told me after what felt like an eternity of medical jargon and urgent whispers. "The bullet grazed her thigh, and there's a fracture, but no major arteries were hit. We need to get her to the hospital immediately for surgery." I nodded numbly, barely processing the words. All I could focus on was Emma's pale face as they carefully lifted her onto a stretcher, her small hand reaching out for mine. "Daddy, don't leave me," she pleaded, her voice weak but still carrying that absolute trust children have in their parents' ability to fix anything. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart," I promised, climbing into the ambulance beside her stretcher. "Daddy's going to be right here the whole time." As our ambulance pulled away from the scene, I caught a glimpse of police cars and what looked like a SWAT van screaming into the neighborhood. Through the small rear window, I could see officers taking positions around Karen's house, their weapons drawn and megaphones in hand. "Karen Mitchell, this is the police," echoed through the evening air. "Come out with your hands visible." But I didn't care about Karen in that moment. All my attention was focused on Emma, whose tiny fingers were cold as ice in my hand, despite the warm evening. "Daddy's here," I kept whispering. "You're so strong, Emma. You're going to be okay." At the hospital, everything became a blur of bright lights, rushing medical personnel, and forms to sign. Emma was whisked away to surgery while I was treated for my shoulder wound, a through and through that had missed anything vital but hurt like hell. The doctor who stitched me up tried to make conversation, probably attempting to distract me from my worry, but I couldn't focus on anything except the clock on the wall and the knowledge that my 5-year-old daughter was somewhere in this building having a bullet wound repaired. The surgery took 4 hours, 4 hours of pacing the waiting room, calling my wife Sarah, who was trapped at a conference in another state, and trying to process how a beautiful evening had turned into this nightmare. The surgeon finally emerged, still in his scrubs, his face serious but not grave. "The surgery went well," he told me. "The bullet fractured her femur, but we've repaired the bone with a plate and screws." She'll need extensive physical therapy, and there will be some scarring, but she should make a full recovery. Relief flooded through me so intensely that I had to sit down to avoid falling over. Can I see her? She's in recovery now. You can see her in about an hour. When I was finally allowed into Emma's room, she looked so small in that hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and four lines. She was awake but groggy from the anesthesia, her leg immobilized in a large cast that seemed to swallow her tiny frame. When she saw me, tears immediately filled her eyes. "Daddy, I was scared," she whispered. "I know, baby. I was scared, too. But you're safe now," I said, taking her hand gently in mine. The police came to take my statement while Emma slept. Detective Rodriguez was a kind woman with children of her own, and she handled the situation with the sensitivity it deserved. She told me that Karen had barricaded herself in her house and was refusing to come out despite hours of negotiation attempts. The SWAT team was still on the scene, but they were treating it as a hostage situation. Even though Karen was alone, she kept screaming about her authority and how people need to respect the rules, Detective Rodriguez said with barely concealed disgust. "We've had complaints about her before: harassment, threats, abuse of power, but nothing like this. She's completely lost it." Over the next few days, as Emma began the long process of healing, the full extent of Karen's reign of terror became clear. The shooting had opened the floodgates, and neighbors who had been afraid to speak up before were now coming forward with stories of harassment, threats, and intimidation. Mrs. Patterson told the police that Karen had threatened to have her house condemned over a minor paint touch-up. The Garcias revealed that she'd called immigration services on them despite their being third-generation Americans. Single mother Janet Walsh described how Karen had tried to get her evicted for her son's bicycle being visible from the street. The neighborhood was in complete chaos. News crews had descended on Maplewood Lane like vultures, calling it the HOA shooting and turning our peaceful street into a media circus. Reporters knocked on doors at all hours, trying to get interviews about the tyrannical HOA president who had snapped. People left flowers, teddy bears, and get-well cards on our lawn for Emma, creating a makeshift memorial that stretched across our entire front yard. But while the media painted Karen as a monster, the neighbors whispered darker truths. Yes, she'd always been controlling and power-hungry. Yes, she'd made everyone's lives miserable with her petty rules and constant violations, but she'd also bragged about her gun collection at HOA meetings, had mentioned her concealed carry permit multiple times, and had made increasingly unhinged threats about what would happen to people who didn't respect her authority. Emma's recovery was slow and painful. The cheerful, bubbly little girl who had pedaled her tricycle with such joy was gone, replaced by a quiet, withdrawn child who flinched at loud noises and asked repeatedly why the mean lady had hurt her. She underwent physical therapy 3 times a week, learning to walk again on a leg that would never be quite the same. The psychological scars were even deeper than the physical ones. Meanwhile, Karen was released on bail after spending only one night in jail, a fact that filled me with such rage I could barely see straight. Her high-powered lawyer had argued that she was a pillar of the community who had simply had a momentary lapse in judgment. The judge, apparently impressed by her clean record and community involvement, set bail at a relatively modest amount and released her with an ankle monitor and orders to stay away from our family. But staying away wasn't enough for me. Not nearly enough. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything except the image of my daughter bleeding on our driveway. The legal system was moving too slowly, too cautiously. Karen had shot a 5-year-old child over a tricycle and was sleeping in her own bed, while Emma woke up screaming from nightmares every night. That's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I started quietly, carefully reaching out to the neighbors who had suffered under Karen's tyranny. Mrs. Jenkins, who had been fined repeatedly for planting roses without HOA approval. Mr. Patel, who had been harassed constantly for parking his work van in his own driveway. Sarah Chin, a single mother who had been threatened with eviction over her son's basketball hoop. The Garcias, who had been subjected to racist harassment disguised as rule enforcement. They were all angry, all scared, and desperate for Karen to face real consequences for her actions. More importantly, they all had stories, evidence, documentation of Karen's abuses of power that went far beyond simple neighborhood disputes. We can't let her stay in this neighborhood, Sarah Chin said during one of our clandestine meetings in my garage. She's dangerous. She's proven she'll escalate to violence. What happens when she gets tired of the ankle monitor and decides someone else deserves to be shot? But what can we do? Mr. Patel asked, his voice heavy with frustration. The police are building their case, but who knows how long that will take. And even if she's convicted, she'll probably get some plea deal and be back here in a few years. I leaned forward, my voice low but determined. We hit her where it really hurts. Her power. The HOA. If we can prove she's been abusing her position, embezzling funds, breaking her own rules, we can remove her completely. Strip away everything that made her feel untouchable. And that's exactly what we did. Over the following weeks, we conducted our own investigation into Karen's tenure as HOA president. What we found was even worse than we'd expected. She had been systematically breaking every rule she enforced on others, approving her own home improvements without board votes, using HOA funds for personal expenses, and keeping detailed files on every neighbor that read like surveillance reports. Mrs. Jenkins discovered records showing that Karen had spent HOA money on a new fence for her backyard, a decorative mailbox that violated the very aesthetic guidelines she enforced on others, and even landscaping services for her personal garden. Mr. Patel found emails where Karen had explicitly threatened neighbors with property liens and legal action for violations that weren't even in the HOA bylaws. Sarah Chin uncovered a recording on her phone from a previous confrontation where Karen had screamed threats about making people pay for defying her authority. But the most damning evidence came from Karen's own computer, which her estranged brother provided after learning about the shooting. Harold Mitchell was horrified by what his sister had done and wanted to help ensure she faced consequences. The computer contained spreadsheets tracking every neighbor's activities, photos taken from inside their homes without permission, and correspondence with a private investigator she'd hired to dig up dirt on families she considered problematic. With all this evidence, we requested an emergency HOA meeting to address Karen's fitness for office. The community center had never been so packed. Every neighbor attended, along with several local reporters who had gotten wind of our investigation. Karen arrived wearing an expensive suit and flanked by her lawyer, clearly expecting to weather another storm through intimidation and legal threats. She was wrong. One by one, neighbors stood up and shared their stories. Mrs. Peterson described finding Karen going through her garbage looking for evidence of rule violations. The Garcias presented documentation of Karen's attempts to have them investigated by multiple city departments based on fabricated complaints. Tom Bradley, a military veteran, told the room how Karen had harassed his wife while he was deployed overseas, including showing up at their house at midnight to measure their grass with a ruler. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up slowly, still feeling the ache in my healing shoulder. Karen Mitchell shot my 5-year-old daughter, I said simply, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. She pulled out a gun and shot a child over a tricycle. But that wasn't the first time she escalated to violence. Mrs. Chin, would you please play that recording? Sarah Chin stood and activated the recording on her phone. Karen's voice filled the room, screaming threats. I'll make sure you regret defying me. I know where you work, where your kids go to school. You have no idea what I'm capable of. The room erupted. Neighbors who had been afraid to speak before were now shouting their own stories of harassment and intimidation. Karen tried to maintain control, banging her gavel and shouting about proper procedures, but her voice was completely drowned out by years of suppressed anger finally finding its voice. I moved to remove Karen Mitchell as HOA president and permanently ban her from any leadership role in this community. I announced when the room finally quieted. The vote wasn't even close. It was unanimous, except for Karen's own vote against the motion. But removing her from the HOA was just the beginning. With all the evidence we'd gathered, I filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit against Karen for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, assault, and attempted murder. My lawyer was confident we had an airtight case, especially with Emma's medical records, the witness statements, and the documentation of Karen's pattern of escalating behavior. The criminal trial came first. Despite her lawyer's attempts to paint her as a dedicated community servant who had simply snapped under pressure, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on charges of aggravated assault, child endangerment, and reckless endangerment. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in prison, calling her actions a betrayal of every principle of community leadership and human decency. The civil trial was even more devastating for Karen. The jury awarded Emma and our family $2.3 million in damages, money that Karen didn't have. She was forced to sell her house, liquidate her investments, and declare bankruptcy. The woman who had terrorized our neighborhood over property values lost everything she owned. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was watching our neighborhood heal and transform. Sarah Chin was elected as the new HOA president, and her first act was to eliminate most of Karen's oppressive rules. Children's toys were allowed in driveways. Homeowners could plant whatever flowers they wanted. The community garden that Karen had blocked for years was finally approved and built. Emma's recovery was slow but steady. Physical therapy helped her regain full use of her leg, though she would always have a slight limp and some scarring. The psychological healing took longer, but with counseling and the love of our neighbors, she gradually began to smile again. The day she asked for her tricycle back was one of the happiest of my life. On the first anniversary of the shooting, our neighborhood held a block party. Emma, now 6 and much stronger, rode her newly painted pink tricycle up and down the street while other children played alongside her. The spot where she'd been shot was now marked by a small garden that the neighbors had planted together, a symbol of how beauty and community could grow from even the darkest moments. Karen Mitchell was serving her sentence in a state prison 2 hours away. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she spent most of her time writing letters to anyone who would listen, still insisting that she had been the victim of a neighborhood conspiracy. She would be eligible for parole in 6 years, but I doubted she would ever return to our community. As I watched Emma laugh and play with her friends that evening, her tricycle catching the same golden light that had made everything seem so perfect a year ago, I felt a deep sense of peace. Justice had been served not through revenge or vigilante violence, but through community action and the legal system working as it should. Maplewood Lane was ours again, and Emma was free to ride her tricycle wherever she pleased.